Okay, so highlights for cardiovascular system. So we talked about the tissue of the cardiovascular system, that fluid connective tissue that we call blood, and now we're working up to the cardio and the vascular part of cardiovascular. So we're going to be talking a bit about the heart. We're going to be talking a bit about the blood vessels, so both the cardio and the vascular components. So like with any of these systems, we're going to talk about the anatomy. We need to know the different parts. If it's an organ, it's pretty complex. We may need to know different areas of it, layers, etc. We're going to talk about what it does. Same thing with the blood vessels. Each blood vessel counts as an organ because it's made up of more than one tissue type. So by definition, each artery or vein or whatever counts as an organ. So that also contributes to this system overall. So let's take a look at these different organs of this organ system. We'll also then look at some overall functions and assessments for the system too. Okay, so like we mentioned, we need to know the main organ, the heart, where it's located, talk about the different membranes, the cavity that it sits within, the different layers of it as well. So just basically the anatomy of it. So this is looking at the layers, so we know that there is an innermost lining that's called the endocardium. We have this thick middle layer through here, which is filled with cardiac muscle. That's called the myocardium. And then we have a very thin outer layer out here, which is called the epicardium, also known as the visceral pericardium. So obviously most of the wall is going to be made up of those contractile cells that we call cardiac muscle. Now remember, that's one of 3 muscle types. It's only found in the heart though. It's not going to be found in the different blood vessels. We have smooth muscle that's found in things like arteries and veins. Okay, so not only will we look at the surface, but of course we'll look inside. We'll talk about the different chambers, how we route the blood through the heart, deoxygenated blood on the right side, oxygenated blood on the left side, how we have these atria up top that are the collecting chambers, and then the ventricles down at the bottom, which are going to be the massive pumps that are routing the blood out the major arteries. So this is going to be the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries going to the lungs. This is going to be the aorta, the largest artery in the body that's routing this oxygenated blood to all the different parts of the body, up to the head and neck, down to the torso, down to the lower limb, etc. So these are the different circuits that we're going to be looking at, how the heart works as a pump, much like your fish tank, if you will. It has a pump that routes fluid through and pushes it around. We're going to be pushing it to and from the lungs. So that's the pulmonary circuit, to and from the body. That's the systemic circuit. And then there's actually a micro, if you will, circulation that goes to and from the heart itself to keep it alive. That's called the coronary circulation or cardiac circulation. All right, so once we get the anatomy down, then we start looking at some of the physiology, how the heart does its job in terms of routing this blood all around where it needs to go. So there's going to be these contraction periods and relaxation periods. So the contraction that we call systole, and then the relaxations that we call diastole. And that's going to occur both in the atria and the ventricles. So 4 chambers, the atria are going to contract together. After they've relaxed and filled and reloaded, if you will, they're going to contract, push the blood down to the ventricles. The ventricles are then going to contract and eject the blood out of the heart. So it's going to go back and forth, atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles. Okay? So that's systole and diastole. And we'll see those terms come up again when we start talking about blood pressure as well. Systolic pressure, diastolic pressure. The other thing that we'll talk about, and you'll see this again and again, is when we're talking about how this system is coordinated and controlled. So in many systems, digestive system, urinary system, and here in the cardiovascular system, we've got an internal control mechanism. In this case, it's called the conduction system of the heart that you see here in yellow, as well as this extrinsic or external control in terms of the nervous system and the endocrine system are 2, if you will, coordinating systems of the body. So we'll talk a little bit how these atria then ventricles get their signal to contract, and it flows through these specialized cardiac muscle cells that are acting like neurons in these pathways that you see here that originate here at the SA node in the posterior wall of the right atrium, and then it travels down these pathways, spreading to both atria, right? and going down to the ventricles to give them the signal. Now, some of the other things that we'll talk about in the chapter is, how these systems and organs work on a normal day-to-day basis or minute-to-minute basis, but also how health science professionals can assess whether those organs are functioning normally. So we'll talk about the EKG, like you see here, this series of repeating 3 waves, P wave, QRS wave, and T wave, which show the electrochemical process that is occurring when the atria and the ventricles are contracting. As much like when we talked about nervous system, where we have charged particles or ions, sodium and potassium mainly, that are moving into and out of the cells, it creates an electrochemical current that then we can measure at the surface of the body. So we'll learn all about that EKG and what each of those waves mean. That's going to be an important topic. And then, like we said, not only the internal control of the cardiovascular system, but also the external control. So the autonomic nervous system that we talked about a little bit before, sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation, how does that affect the heart? Speed it up, slow it down. And then also, if we have these nerves that are going down to it telling what to do, we must have a control center that are routing those signals to it. And that's going to belong to the brain, but it's going to be in the lower parts of the brain. So the medulla oblongata is going to be our main cardiovascular control center. Okay, so then we move to the blood vessels, and the blood vessels, you basically need to know that there are 5 different types: arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. Okay, you need to be able to describe each type in terms of its anatomy and its physiology. So how is it structured differently or uniquely, and how does that relate to its particular function? So for instance, even when we're comparing an artery and a vein, we see the artery here on the left and the vein on the right. They have the same layers to their wall when we look at them, but we can see if we look at the thickness of the wall of the vein, it's relatively thin compared to the thickness of the wall of a similar sized artery. And that's because the arteries are always conducting blood away from the heart. That's the rule. And they get these massive tidal waves of blood being pushed down by the ventricle. And so they have to be able to withstand those tidal waves of blood and conduct that blood down further. So they need a thick wall to be able to resist that and also be able to kind of squeeze and help this process of moving the blood around. Meanwhile, the veins, if we think about these circuits, are on the opposite end, and the veins have a much lower pressure blood and much lower blood that's going through them. And so they only require a thinner wall. And in fact, there are aspects to them, like these valves like you see here, much like the valves in the heart, that assist the blood in getting back to the heart. Now, capillaries certainly are specialized blood vessels too. We said you need to know all 5 types of vessels. That includes the capillaries, and the capillaries are key ones where these are the exchange points with the tissues. We know that the blood and the cardiovascular system is about distribution, delivering things to and from the body, but like the mail service, it's not just driving through the neighborhood. We've got to be able to allow exchange, drop things off, pick things up, etc. And that happens at the capillaries. They have a super thin wall. They're very, very numerous. They go everywhere, almost everywhere. And so that's where we can allow these substances to go into and out of the blood, into and out of the tissues. So again, it relates to structure and function. Extremely thin walls of these, which means that things can be transported across them. We get a little bit into the forces that are responsible for moving these things across the wall. Mostly it's diffusion, right? High concentration and low concentration, but in some cases it also has to do with fluid pressure, which we call hydrostatic pressure, pushing it through, kind of like if you are doing a coffee, right? If you're filtering coffee, if you cave to the evils of coffee like I have, then when you make coffee with a drip filter in the morning, it is hydrostatic pressure, fluid pressure that's pushing that through the filter itself. So that also influences the movement of fluid into and out of the capillaries. Okay, so then you go around the circuit, talk about those small veins that we call venules, as well as the veins themselves. And that takes you all the way around this circuitous cardiovascular system. Now, towards the end of the chapter, we do talk some physiology as well. What do we mean by blood pressure? The fact that that's the pressure in the arteries, and how it's, like we said, we've got systolic and diastolic pressure. We need to know what those are. We'll talk about those in lab as well. But for the most part, like we've seen before, it's about the organs involved, their particular structures, and what they do in order to support the system and to support you in terms of maintaining your life, maintaining homeostasis inside the body.